The muddy waters of the Arkansas River churned past Wichita's weathered docks as Reverend Luke Carter watched another steamboat struggle against the current. His collar felt tight in the Kansas heat, a constant reminder of the calling he'd adopted to atone for his past. The bustling river port had grown significantly since he'd first drifted through 5 years ago, though its soul remained as turbid as the waters that sustained it. Through the grimy windows of the River Queen Saloon, Luke observed Eleanor Hall polishing glasses with practiced efficiency, her movements carrying a grace that seemed out of place in such an establishment. She was the owner's daughter, and Luke had watched her grow from a spirited girl into a composed young woman during his time ministering to Wichita's wayward souls. Joshua Lopez sat at his usual corner table, methodically stacking coins as he dealt cards to the evening's victims. The cattle baron had built his empire through equal parts cunning and cruelty, though most folks only saw the expensive suit and charitable donations to the town council. Luke knew better. He'd buried enough of Lopez's business rivals to recognize the pattern. The saloon's owner, Nathan Hall, stumbled through the batwing doors, his face ashen. Luke didn't need divine inspiration to read the man's desperate expression. Hall had been betting heavily at Lopez's private games for months now, trying to recoup losses that only seemed to multiply. Eleanor's worried glance toward her father spoke volumes about the family's mounting troubles. "Another round, Reverend?" Eleanor's voice carried forced cheerfulness as she approached his table. Luke declined with a slight shake of his head, noting the shadows under her eyes. The whole town knew Nathan Hall was in deep with Lopez, but few suspected just how desperate things had become. Luke had overheard whispers of an unusual arrangement being negotiated to settle the debt. The evening crowd filtered in as the sun dipped below the horizon, bringing with it the usual mix of river workers, cowboys, and merchants. Among them came Isaac Nelson, Lopez's chief enforcer, moving with the calculated precision of a predator. Luke watched him exchange meaningful glances with his employer before taking up position near the bar. Charlotte Carter, no relation to Luke despite the shared surname, entered shortly after, her presence drawing every eye in the establishment. As Lopez's personal accountant, she maintained a careful distance from the violence that surrounded him, though her ledgers held secrets that could hang half the territory's supposed gentlemen. The air grew thick with pipe smoke and tension as Lopez rose from his table, gesturing for Nathan Hall to join him in the back room. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she served another round of drinks, clearly aware that whatever transpired in that room would shape her future. Luke found his fingers unconsciously touching the revolver he still carried beneath his black coat. Several minutes passed before Nathan Hall emerged, his face now bearing the hollow look of a man who'd sold his soul. Lopez followed, wearing the satisfied smile of a card sharp who'd just sprung his trap. The cattle baron's voice carried across the saloon as he announced, "Friends, help me celebrate. Miss Eleanor Hall has agreed to become Mrs. Lopez, saving her dear father from some rather unfortunate circumstances." The shock that rippled through the room was palpable. Eleanor stood frozen behind the bar, the color draining from her face as she processed her father's betrayal. Luke's hand tightened around his glass. Memories of another life, one of violence and vengeance, threatening to surface. He'd sworn to leave that path behind, but watching Eleanor's world crumble stirred something dangerous in his soul. Lopez's men began clearing the saloon, suggesting everyone take their business elsewhere for the evening. As the patrons filtered out, Luke caught Eleanor's eye. The silent plea in her gaze struck him like a physical blow. He'd spent years preaching about divine justice, but sometimes the Lord worked through more direct means. The weight of his gun seemed to grow heavier with each step toward the door. Later that night, Luke knelt in prayer at the small church he'd helped build near the river. The candlelight cast dancing shadows on walls that had heard countless confessions, though none quite like the one he offered now. "Lord," he whispered, "forgive me for what I'm about to do." His fingers traced the worn grip of his revolver as he contemplated the path ahead, one that would require him to embrace the very demons he'd spent years trying to exorcise. The moonlight rippled across the river's surface as Luke emerged from the church, his decision weighing as heavy as the gun at his hip. He knew Lopez's men would be watching Eleanor's father's saloon through the night, making sure old Nathan didn't try to slip away before the morning's cruel transaction. The thought of Eleanor being traded like cattle made his stomach turn, but rushing in without a plan would only get them both killed. He made his way through the quiet streets of Pueblo, noting how the normally bustling river port had grown tense and still, like the air before a storm. The townsfolk knew Lopez's reputation, how he'd gradually tightened his grip on communities up and down the river, using debt and violence to build his empire. Those who resisted tended to disappear, their bodies occasionally washing up downstream near Durango. At the edge of town, Luke found Joshua's workshop still lit despite the late hour. The weathered carpenter had been one of his first friends when he'd arrived in Pueblo, and more importantly, he knew every secret and whispered rumor that passed through the docks. Luke needed information if he was going to move against Lopez, and Joshua's shop was where rivermen gathered to trade stories between jobs. "Evening, preacher," Joshua said without looking up from the chair he was mending. "Figured you'd be by after what happened at Nathan's place." He gestured to a bottle on his workbench. "Have a seat. Got some things you ought to hear about our friend Lopez and his dealings with the town council." Luke settled onto a wooden crate as Joshua explained how Lopez had spent years buying influence, placing key allies in positions of power. The cattle baron hadn't just corrupted individual men, he'd woven himself into the very fabric of river commerce. Every marshal and judge between Pueblo and Tucson was in his pocket, making legal recourse impossible. "There's more," Joshua continued, lowering his voice. "Word is Lopez plans to move Eleanor upriver to Wichita once he has her. Got himself a mansion there where he keeps his collection. Young women whose families couldn't pay their debts. Some say he sells them to wealthy buyers from back east. Others say he keeps them for himself. Either way, none of them are ever seen again." Luke's knuckles whitened around his glass as he absorbed the information. He'd suspected Lopez's operation went beyond simple cattle rustling and protection rackets. But this was darker than he'd imagined. The scope of it all made his task seem impossible, yet he knew he couldn't walk away. "I need to know who's still clean," Luke said finally. "Anyone in town with influence who hasn't been bought." Joshua thought for a moment before mentioning Caroline, the widow who ran the riverboat shipping office. Her late husband had been one of the few to stand against Lopez, dying under suspicious circumstances shortly after. Caroline had taken over the business and maintained her independence through sheer force of will. Dawn was breaking as Luke left Joshua's shop, his mind churning with possibilities. He'd need allies, resources, and a way to move against Lopez that wouldn't immediately mark Eleanor's father for death. The shipping office would be opening soon, and with it, perhaps a chance to begin building his response to the evil that had taken root along the river. As he walked, Luke felt the familiar weight of violence settling over him like an old coat. He'd spent years preaching peace and redemption, but his past life had taught him that some men only understood the language of lead and blood. Lopez had built his kingdom on the suffering of others, using the river's vital trade routes to expand his influence. Now that same river might prove his undoing, if Luke could find a way to turn it against him. The morning sun was painting the water gold when Luke reached Caroline's office, its weathered sign creaking in the breeze. He paused at the door, offering one final prayer. Not for forgiveness this time, but for the strength to see through what must be done. Then he stepped inside, ready to begin planning the dismantling of Lopez's empire, one piece at a time. Caroline's office was a testament to the river's influence. Maps of waterways lined the walls, and ledgers filled with shipping manifests crowded her desk. She looked up from her work, her eyes widening slightly at Luke's appearance. He knew he must look a sight. Trail dust coating his black clothes, the careful facade of a peaceful preacher wearing thin around the edges. "I need information about Lopez's shipments," Luke said without preamble, "particularly anything heading toward Durango." Caroline's pen stilled against the paper, and she glanced nervously at the door before responding. The morning light streaming through the window caught the silver threading through her dark hair, marking the years she'd spent building her business on these dangerous waters. "You're asking dangerous questions, Reverend," she said quietly. But there was steel beneath her soft tone. "Lopez has friends in every port from here to Pueblo. Even the legitimate merchants won't cross him. Not after what happened to the Whitman family last spring." She shuffled through some papers, seemingly casual, but Luke caught the meaning in her movements. The river's current carried more than just cargo. It carried secrets, too, whispered from port to port. Luke had heard about the Whitmans, their warehouse burned, their boat scuttled, all because they'd refused to pay Lopez's ever-increasing protection fees. The Baron's cruelty served as both warning and example to others who might resist. The sun hung like a copper penny in the hazy summer sky as Reverend Luke Carter made his way down the muddy street of Durango, his boots leaving deep impressions in the rain-softened earth. The trading boats along the river had brought whispers of trouble. Nathan Lopez's gambling debts to cattle baron Isaac Hall had finally come due, and the price was steeper than mere money. Carter's weathered hand absently touched the worn Bible in his coat pocket, its pages concealing a past he'd tried to leave behind. Inside the River Queen Saloon, Caroline Lopez wiped glasses with trembling hands, trying to ignore the heated voices coming from her father's office. The walls seemed to vibrate with Isaac Hall's thunderous demands, punctuated by the desperate pleading of Nathan Lopez. She knew their mounting debts had reached a breaking point, but nothing had prepared her for Hall's ultimatum. Either Nathan would sign over his only daughter's hand in marriage to Hall's brutish son Joshua, or the entire Lopez family would find themselves homeless by sundown. Reverend Carter paused outside the saloon's swinging doors, memories of another time and place crowding his thoughts. 10 years earlier, he'd been known as Lightning Luke across 3 territories, his twin colts dealing a different kind of justice before he'd found his calling. Now, watching Caroline through the window, he felt that familiar righteous anger stirring in his soul. Her innocence reminded him too much of his own sister Eleanor, lost to another powerful man's cruelty years ago. Joshua Hall strutted through town like a peacock, flanked by his father's hired guns, the Nelson brothers, Caleb and Charlotte. The siblings had built a reputation for ruthless efficiency, though rumors suggested Charlotte was the truly dangerous one. They'd helped Isaac Hall build his empire through intimidation and violence, forcing river merchants to pay protection money and driving honest traders into bankruptcy. The Nelsons took particular pleasure in their work, treating brutality like a form of art. When Caroline emerged from the saloon at dusk, her eyes red from crying, Carter stepped from the shadows. "Miss Lopez," he said softly, "I couldn't help but overhear your father's predicament." She startled, then relaxed slightly at his clerical collar. "Unless you're carrying enough gold to clear $1,000 debt, Reverend, I don't see how you can help." The bitterness in her voice cut him deeply, reminding him of promises he'd made and failed to keep in another life. That night, Carter knelt in prayer at the small church on the outskirts of Durango, but his thoughts kept drifting to the gun belt buried beneath the floorboards of his modest room. The town council, led by the corrupt Judge Allen, had long turned a blind eye to Hall's activities in exchange for generous contributions to their personal coffers. Legal justice would find no purchase here. Sometimes, Carter reflected, the Lord worked through less conventional means. Word spread quickly through Durango's streets. Caroline Lopez was to be married to Joshua Hall within the week. The young woman's defeat was visible in her slumped shoulders as she went about her duties at the saloon, now effectively owned by Isaac Hall through Nathan's accumulated debts. But Carter noticed something else in her eyes when she thought no one was watching, a dangerous spark of defiance that mirrored his own growing resolve. Rose Nelson, the youngest of the Nelson clan, secretly visited Carter's church that evening. Unlike her siblings, she'd grown weary of the family's violent ways. She revealed that Isaac Hall had been systematically destroying river trading families for years, forcing daughters into marriages that gave him control of key waterfront properties. The Lopez situation was just the latest in a long pattern of corruption that stretched all the way to Tucson. Carter spent the next day observing the Hall operation, noting guard rotations and gathering intelligence. He watched Joshua Hall inspect his father's latest shipment of rifles, intended to arm a small army of mercenaries gathering in the hills outside town. The cattle baron was preparing for something bigger than just a forced marriage. He was positioning himself to control the entire river trade route from Durango to Pueblo. As sunset painted the river crimson, Carter made his decision. He couldn't stand by and watch another innocent life destroyed by powerful men's greed. But this time, he wouldn't act alone. Rose Nelson had introduced him to others who opposed Hall's tyranny. Dispossessed traders, former lawmen, and even some of Judge Allen's own family members who were disgusted by their patriarch's corruption. The time had come to remind Durango that justice wasn't just a word in a prayer book. Sometimes it needed teeth. The moonless night cloaked Carter's meeting with his newfound allies in the abandoned cooper's shop by the river. Rose had gathered a diverse group. Eleanor, a sharp-tongued telegraph operator who intercepted Hall's coded messages. Nathan, a former Texas Ranger turned riverboat pilot who knew every bend and shadow of the waterway. And Isaac, a Cherokee trader whose family had lost their landing rights to Hall's expanding empire. The candlelight cast their determined faces in flickering amber as they plotted. Hall's got 30 hired guns camped in the hills, Eleanor reported, spreading out a hand-drawn map. They're waiting for something big, a shipment coming upriver from Pueblo next week. Whatever it is, he's paying triple wages to keep it quiet. Her fingers traced the trade routes that Hall sought to dominate, each one a potential choke point for commerce between Tucson and points east. Nathan contributed his own intelligence, gained from countless hours navigating the treacherous waters. There's only 3 deep-water approaches to his warehouse compound. The main dock's heavily guarded, but there's a hidden landing on the north bend. Used to be a Comanche crossing point. If we time it right with the moon and current, we could slip in undetected. Carter listened intently, his preacher's collar feeling tighter with each passing moment. The path ahead would require more than just righteous fury. It demanded careful strategy. Before we move against Hall directly, we need to understand what he's planning, and we need to get Charlotte somewhere safe. The others nodded grimly, knowing the young woman's fate was tied to larger schemes. Isaac spoke up, his voice quiet but firm. My people have a camp 3 days right upstream, beyond Hall's reach. She'd be protected there while we deal with this snake. He paused, dark eyes reflecting the candlelight. But getting her out of that compound won't be easy. Hall keeps her under close watch, especially since your, sermon last Sunday. The group spent hours refining their plan, accounting for every contingency. Rose would create a distraction at the saloon, while Eleanor arranged for a mechanical failure at the telegraph office to disrupt Hall's communications. Nathan would have his riverboat ready at the hidden landing, while Isaac's hunters would ensure their escape route remained clear. As dawn approached, Carter found himself alone with Rose in the cooper's shop. She studied him with knowing eyes. "You're not just doing this for Charlotte, are you?" she asked softly. "This is about redemption." Carter didn't answer immediately, his thoughts drifting to blood-soaked memories he'd tried to leave behind in Wichita. "Sometimes the Lord's work requires more than just prayer," he finally replied, checking the revolver hidden beneath his black coat. "And sometimes redemption comes through justice rather than mercy." Rose nodded, understanding the weight of violence that lay ahead. They both knew that confronting Hall's empire would demand a toll in blood. The next morning brought unexpected complications. Joshua Hall rode into town with a dozen new gunmen, their horses raising dust clouds that choked the narrow streets. Carter watched from the shadows as they escorted a well-dressed stranger, clearly a government official from his bearing, into Judge Allen's offices. Whatever Hall was planning, it had official backing. Eleanor slipped Carter a hastily transcribed telegram later that afternoon. The message confirmed their worst fears. Hall wasn't just consolidating local power. He was positioning himself to control military supply contracts for 3 territories. The forced marriage to Charlotte was merely a piece in a larger game of empire building that threatened to reshape the entire region. As sunset approached, Carter met with Nathan by the riverbank, their voices barely audible above the water's constant flow. "Tomorrow night," the former ranger said, checking his pocket watch. "The moon will be dark, and I've heard Hall's planning some kind of celebration at the main house. It's our best chance to get Charlotte out." Carter nodded, knowing that the next 24 hours would determine not just Charlotte's fate, but the future of every soul along this troubled river. He touched the worn Bible in his coat pocket, then the cold steel beside it. Both would be needed before this was over. The time for sermons had passed. Now only action would serve the cause of justice. The pre-dawn hours found Carter making his way through Pueblo's muddy side streets, his boots silent on the damp earth. He'd spent the night in prayer and preparation, knowing that the coming day would test not just his resolve, but his ability to keep violence as a last resort. The morning mist rolling off the river shrouded his movements as he made his way to Nathan's modest boarding house near the docks. Inside, Nathan had laid out an arsenal on his worn oak table, not just guns, but tools for their rescue attempt. Rope, dark cloth for covering lanterns, and crude maps of Hall's estate drawn from memory by sympathetic workers. The former ranger's eyes were hard as he detailed the guard rotations he'd observed over the past week. "Hall's bringing in extra muscle for tonight's celebration," Nathan explained, his finger tracing routes across the rough sketches. "But they'll be focused on protecting the dignitaries from Durango and Tucson. The back entrance to the servants' quarters will be less watched." He paused, studying Carter's face. The muddy waters of the Arkansas River churned violently against the weathered pilings of Wichita's North Dock as Luke Carter paced beneath the stormy afternoon sky. His clerical collar felt tight against his throat, a constant reminder of the vows he'd taken to forsake violence. But watching Caroline Lopez being dragged aboard Nathan Hall's riverboat had shattered those vows like brittle glass. Her father's desperate gambling had sealed her fate, but Luke couldn't let an innocent woman pay the price for another's sins. Through the driving rain, Luke observed Hall's men loading crates onto the massive paddle wheel steamer. The cattle baron had built his empire by controlling river trade between Wichita and Pueblo, choking out honest merchants with extortionate rates while bribing the town council to look the other way. Caroline's father had borrowed heavily to keep his saloon afloat, and now Hall meant to collect his due in the cruelest way possible. Thunder cracked overhead as Luke's hand unconsciously brushed the worn pearl grip of the Colt hidden beneath his black coat. Before finding God, he'd been the deadliest gun in 3 territories. Now, watching Caroline struggle against her captors through the riverboat's windows, he felt that old familiar rage rising up like floodwater. Some sins, he realized, were worth bearing if they prevented greater evils. Inside the riverboat's opulent gambling salon, Nathan Hall lounged in his favorite leather chair, savoring both his brandy and his latest acquisition. Caroline stood before him, proud despite her bonds, green eyes blazing with defiance. "Your father's debt is now paid in full," Hall drawled, gesturing to his ledger. "You'll find I can be quite generous to those who please me." Caroline spat in his face, earning a brutal backhand from Joshua Nelson, Hall's hulking enforcer. Luke slipped aboard just as the evening fog started rolling in off the river. He'd counted 12 of Hall's gunmen, including Nelson, all veterans of the range wars that had bloodied Kansas territory. Each man was a killer, but Luke had once been death incarnate before a minister's words and a dead man's Bible had shown him another path. Now that path led him back to violence, but this time in service of something greater than mere survival. The first shot came from the shadows near the grand staircase, dropping one of Hall's men before anyone realized the preacher had moved. Luke's next 2 bullets found their marks with surgical precision, years of gunfighting muscle memory overriding a decade of peaceful service. As chaos erupted in the salon, he heard Caroline scream from the upper deck, followed by Nelson's booming voice ordering men to protect Hall. Racing up the ornate stairs, Luke encountered 3 more gunmen. His Colt barked twice more, the heavy revolver's recoil familiar as an old friend's handshake. 2 men fell, but the third's bullet creased Luke's ribs, setting his side on fire. He stumbled into a wall, leaving a bloody handprint on the expensive wallpaper, but managed to put a round through his attacker's throat before the man could fire again. Caroline's struggles had carried her and Nelson onto the hurricane deck, where the enforcer now held her as a shield against Luke's advance. "Drop the gun, preacher," Nelson growled, pressing his revolver to Caroline's temple. "Hall wants words with you before you die." Luke's response was to shoot the lantern hanging above them, plunging the deck into darkness. In the confusion, he tackled Nelson, sending all 3 crashing onto the rain-slick boards. The fight that followed was brutal and desperate. Nelson's superior size and strength nearly proved decisive, but Luke's years of close combat experience ultimately won out. As Caroline scrambled clear, Luke managed to get his arm around Nelson's throat in a vicious chokehold. The enforcer thrashed and clawed, but Luke held on grimly until the massive body went limp. He hadn't killed the man, that much mercy he could still afford. But Nelson wouldn't be troubling anyone for a while. Hall himself proved surprisingly formidable, emerging from his private cabin with a derringer in each hand. His first shot caught Luke in the shoulder, spinning him against the railing. The second missed as Caroline tackled the cattle baron from behind, proving she was far from some helpless damsel. Luke's final bullet took Hall in the chest, the impact lifting him off his feet and sending him crashing through the cabin's window in a shower of glass and blood. In the aftermath, as lawmen swarmed the blood-spattered riverboat, Luke sat with Caroline in the salon where her nightmare had begun. She tended his wounds with gentle hands while he struggled with the weight of lives taken, even in a righteous cause. "God hasn't abandoned you," she whispered, reading the conflict in his eyes. "Sometimes his work requires a strong arm as much as a loving heart." Looking at her, Luke realized that perhaps redemption came in many forms. The investigation revealed the full scope of Hall's corruption, including documents proving he'd rigged Caroline's father's games to force him into debt. The town council's complicity was exposed, leading to a general house cleaning of Wichita's government. Caroline's father retained his saloon, though he swore off gambling for good, and if the patrons noticed that the owner's daughter seemed particularly fond of the soft-spoken preacher who now gave Sunday services, they were wise enough not to comment. As summer faded into autumn, Luke often found himself on the riverbank where it had all begun, watching the Arkansas flow past like time itself. Caroline would join him sometimes, her presence a reminder that violence and peace, justice and mercy were not always the opposites they seemed. He still wore his collar, still preached God's word, but now he understood that sometimes shepherd must also be warrior to truly protect his flock. The peace that had settled over Wichita proved fragile when word arrived that Nathan Hall had escaped custody during his transfer to the territorial prison. Luke knew the cattle baron would return, not just for revenge, but to reclaim what he saw as his rightful domain along the Arkansas River. The preacher spent long hours in his small church, wrestling not with God, but with the knowledge that violence would once again stain the waters that had brought both destruction and redemption to their community. Caroline found him there one evening, the setting sun painting the chapel windows in shades of blood and gold. "The sentries spotted riders coming from the north," she said softly. "Hall's gathered a small army of hired guns from Pueblo. Father says they'll be here by morning." Her hand touched the worn wood of the pew where Luke sat, fingers tracing old bullet scars from that first confrontation months ago. Luke nodded, his expression grim but resolved. "I've sent word to Joshua and Caleb. They'll bring their men from the river settlements downstream. The town won't stand alone this time." He stood, and Caroline noticed he wore his gun belt beneath his black coat, the leather worn smooth from years of use before he'd found his calling. "But I need you to gather the women and children at Eleanor's place across the river. Whatever happens tomorrow, I won't risk innocent lives." The night passed in tense preparation as the townspeople barricaded streets and positioned shooters in the upper floors of buildings facing the northern approach. Luke moved among them, offering quiet words of encouragement and checking defensive positions. He knew Hall would expect resistance but would come anyway, driven by pride and the need to prove his power hadn't been broken by his fall from grace. Dawn broke cold and clear, the river mist burning away to reveal 24 riders approaching at a measured pace. Hall rode at their head, his once fine clothes now trail-worn, his face gaunt but his eyes burning with malevolent purpose. He reined up just beyond rifle range, studying the town's preparations with a twisted smile. "Send out the preacher," he shouted. "Just him and me, settle this proper-like." Luke stepped into the street, his collar gleaming white against his dark coat. "You had your chance at civilization, Nathan. You chose differently." His voice carried clearly in the morning air. "Leave now and you can keep riding. Stay, and this ends today, one way or another." Behind him, he could hear the soft click of rifles being cocked, knew without looking that every window and rooftop held defenders ready to protect their homes. Hall's laugh was bitter as desert wind. "You think these sheep can stand against my wolves? I built this town, preacher. Everything here belongs to me, including that pretty saloon girl you're so fond of." He drew his pistol with practiced speed. Time to remind everyone what happens when they defy Nathan Hall. The first shot cracked across the street, but Luke had already moved, drawing and firing in one fluid motion that belied his peaceful calling. Hall's shoulder jerked back, his second shot going wild as his men spurred forward. The street erupted in gunfire, the defending townspeople proving they were anything but sheep as they met the charge with disciplined volleys that dropped several riders before they reached the barricades. Luke rolled behind a water trough as bullets splintered the wood around him. He glimpsed Hall dismounting behind an overturned wagon, clutching his wounded shoulder but still very much in the fight. The battle spread through the streets, each side seeking cover as the morning dissolved into chaos. Through the smoke and dust, Luke caught glimpses of familiar faces. The saloon keeper firing a shotgun from his doorway, Joshua's rivermen engaging Hall's flanking riders, Caleb directing defenders from the hotel balcony. The fighting intensified as both sides committed fully to the struggle, neither willing to yield. Luke worked his way methodically toward Hall's position, knowing this would only end when one of them fell. A bullet creased his arm, another tore his coat, but he pressed on, driven by the certainty that this was his true calling. Not just to preach peace, but to defend it with whatever means necessary. As the sun climbed higher, the tide began to turn. Hall's men, facing unexpected resistance and mounting casualties, began to fall back. Luke finally cornered Hall in the stable, where the cattle baron waited with empty gun and bloody grin. "What now, preacher?" he sneered. "Going to send me to meet my maker?" Luke's aim remained steady. "No, Nathan. I'm going to see you face justice, proper justice this time. The territory marshal's already riding from Durango. You'll stand trial for your crimes, every last one of them." He saw something break in Hall's eyes then, the realization that his empire of violence and corruption had crumbled beyond repair. The aftermath brought both healing and change to Wichita. The town buried its dead, repaired its buildings, and emerged stronger for having faced down its demons together. Luke and Caroline were married that winter in the same church where the first shots had been fired, the bullet holes in its walls patched but deliberately left visible. A reminder that peace must sometimes be defended with courage and sacrifice. The morning sun cast long shadows across Durango's dusty streets as Luke Carter led his makeshift army toward the Lopez Ranch. Behind him rode Nathan Hall, the reformed preacher whose past as a Union Army chaplain had taught him that sometimes salvation required gunpowder. Alongside them were 24 rivermen, hardened traders and boatmen who'd lost everything to Isaac Lopez's ruthless control of the waterways. Caroline Allen watched from her hiding place in Eleanor Nelson's boarding house as the men rode past. Just days ago, she'd been nothing more than a saloon owner's daughter, until her father's gambling debts had led Lopez to claim her as payment. Now she prayed these men could end Lopez's reign of terror without adding more bloodshed to the region's troubled waters. Joshua Nelson, Eleanor's son and the town's young deputy, paced nervously in his mother's kitchen. He knew Luke's plan was risky, using the morning's regular ammunition delivery as cover to infiltrate Lopez's heavily guarded compound. But after watching Lopez's men terrorize honest traders for years while the corrupt town council turned a blind eye, Joshua was ready to risk his badge for justice. The plan hinged on Rose Carter, Luke's wife and the finest riverboat pilot on this stretch of the Arkansas. She would draw Lopez's attention with a supposed delivery while the others approached from the desert side. Luke touched the locket containing her picture, remembering how Lopez's men had burned their first boat and nearly drowned her 2 years ago. Today would settle all debts. At the Lopez Ranch, Caleb Hall, Nathan's brother and Lopez's unwitting bookkeeper, prepared the ledgers for the morning's business. His stomach churned as he reviewed the growing list of acquisitions, properties, and lives Lopez had stolen through rigged gambling and false debts. Caroline Allen's name was just the latest entry. Caleb knew helping Luke's raid would mean exile from Durango, but his conscience could bear no more. The sound of Rose's riverboat whistle echoed across the water, right on schedule. Lopez's men scrambled to the docks, expecting their weekly shipment of rifles from Wichita. Instead, they found Rose's boat riding suspiciously high in the water, empty of cargo but perfect for a quick escape. The distraction worked exactly as planned. Luke and Nathan led their men through the desert brush, using the morning shadows for cover. Years of tracking Lopez's movements had taught them the compound's blind spots. As they approached, Caleb appeared at the back gate, hands trembling as he handed over the key. "Caroline's in the main house," he whispered. "Lopez is showing her off to the council members like a prize mare." Inside, Caroline fought to maintain her composure as Lopez paraded her before Durango's leading citizens. "See how civilized we are," he boasted. "The girl's father owed a debt, and now it's settled properly." The council members nodded, their own corrupt dealings with Lopez ensuring their compliance. None would meet Caroline's eyes. The first shot came from Nathan's rifle, shattering the parlor window and sending the council members diving for cover. Luke's men burst through the doors while Rose's crew, who'd circled back through the willows, stormed the compound from the river. Lopez reached for his gun but found Caleb's pistol already pressed against his temple. "The ledgers don't lie," Caleb said quietly. What followed was not the bloodbath many expected. Lopez's men, mostly hired guns with no loyalty beyond their pay, surrendered quickly. The council members, faced with Caleb's damning records, chose cooperation over martyrdom. Lopez himself, stripped of his power, seemed to shrink before their eyes. Just another aging bully whose empire of fear had finally crumbled. Caroline walked free under her own power, head held high. Luke offered to help her father rebuild the saloon, while Nathan spoke of starting a riverside chapel where honest traders could find rest and fellowship. Rose's boat would lead a flotilla of independent merchants, ensuring no single man could ever again control the river's commerce. As the sun set over Durango that evening, Joshua Nelson tacked a notice to the town hall door. It listed Lopez's crimes and announced a special election to replace the disgraced council. Caleb's ledgers would ensure justice was done through the law, not violence. The river brought change to Durango once again, but this time it carried hope instead of fear. Eleanor's boarding house hosted a quiet celebration that night. Caroline smiled as she watched Luke and Rose plan new trade routes, while Nathan discussed riverside missions with Joshua. Her father, humbled but healing, promised to make amends. The river's song drifted through the open windows, its ancient voice singing of redemption, justice, and the courage to stand against tyranny, even when it wore a respectable face. This chapter in Durango's history would be remembered not for its gunfights or revenge, but for how a community finally found the courage to reclaim its soul. The river still flowed, the trade still moved, but now it carried the promise of something better. A future where debts were measured in more than just gold, and where justice flowed as freely as the waters themselves. In the weeks that followed, Durango underwent a transformation as profound as the changing seasons. The town council chambers, once a den of corruption, now hosted open meetings where citizens like Eleanor and Rose helped draft new ordinances to protect river traders from predatory practices. Luke's experience proved invaluable as they established fair rates and regulations that would serve both merchants and townsfolk alike. Caroline found herself drawn to the riverside more often, watching the boats that now moved freely without fear of extortion. She'd sometimes catch glimpses of Nathan there, too, his preacher's collar replaced by more practical attire as he helped coordinate the loading of supplies bound for the new mission he and Joshua were establishing upriver. Their shared glances carried the weight of all they'd survived together, and the promise of what might still come. The Baron's former holdings were divided fairly under Caleb's careful supervision. Where once stood empty warehouses hoarding wealth, new businesses emerged. Rose's trading company expanded, employing many of the town's previously desperate families. The change wasn't just economic. There was a new spirit of cooperation that crossed old social boundaries. Isaac's rehabilitation proved more challenging than his daughter had hoped. Some nights, the ghosts of his gambling debts still haunted him, but Eleanor's boarding house provided structure and purpose. He found unexpected solace in maintaining the property's gardens, the simple act of nurturing growth somehow healing something broken inside him. Josephine and Charlotte, once trapped in the Baron's web of influence, now ran a successful dressmaking shop that catered to the increasing traffic of legitimate traders and their families. Their testimony had helped bring down the corrupt officials, and their courage inspired others to speak out against lingering injustices. Luke's reputation grew along the river routes, not as a gunman, but as a fair mediator. When disputes arose between traders and townfolk from Tucson to Pueblo, his counsel was sought. The violence of his past gave weight to his words of peace, and he found an unexpected calling in building bridges rather than burning them. The autumn brought news that the Baron had been formally sentenced in Wichita, his network of corruption exposed across 3 territories. But it was the smaller victories that meant more to those who'd lived through Durango's dark days. The first free election of town officials, the establishment of a fair trade council, the return of families who'd fled the Baron's reign. Nathan's church, once nearly empty, now served as both a place of worship and a community gathering space. He'd learned that redemption wasn't just a matter of faith, but of action, and his sermons spoke as much about justice on earth as salvation in heaven. The rifle that had helped free the town now hung above his study door, a reminder that sometimes righteousness required more than prayer. One evening, as the setting sun painted the river gold, Caroline stood on Eleanor's porch watching boats dock at the newly built trading pier. Joshua's young son played nearby, his laughter mixing with the sound of water and commerce. She thought about how close they'd come to losing everything, and how the courage to fight back had saved not just her life, but the soul of their community. The river still carried its ancient stories, but now it also bore witness to a new chapter in Durango's history. Where once it had been a route for escape, it became a path toward something better, a testament to how justice, like water, would always find its way forward, wearing down the stones of tyranny until they became nothing more than sand upon the shore. As autumn deepened into winter, the town prepared for its first truly free Christmas celebration in years. The boarding house would host a feast where former enemies would break bread together, where the lines between merchant and townsperson, rich and poor, would blur in the spirit of true community. The river's song had changed from a lament to a hymn of hope, its waters reflecting not just the sky above, but the promise of what people could achieve when they found the courage to stand together against the darkness.